Welcome to today's podcast, which will look today at one of the most current researches called 25 Years After, Dealing with the Past in Kosovo, which was authored by Florian Bieber, Donika Emini and Marina Vulović. Today I'm sitting here with two of the authors, Florian Bieber and Donika, which will have together a look into the research and the most current ideas on dealing with the past in Kosovo, and maybe also we'll discuss a little bit about the region. Welcome very much to be here in Pristina. Welcome very much here in the Barabas Center and discussing with us today.
Well, thank you.
First of all, I want to start with a very introductory question, meaning what was your initial hypothesis and idea behind this research, meaning why it is still important after 25 years after the war to discuss dealing with the past in Kosovo, why it is important to discuss reconciliation in Kosovo. What was your motivation behind doing this research and looking deeper into these questions?
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, the topic of dealing with the past remains after mass violence a topic for decades in any society, whether it's Kosovo, Serbia, or any country globally. And then in particular in a context like Kosovo, where many of the consequences still are very much present in society and in politics. So it's not something which is closed, a chapter of the past to deal with, but it's also dealing with the present to some degree. So it remains highly relevant, both internally within society, but also in its relations with its neighbors, in relations with the larger world. There's a lot of contestation which Kosovo is facing in terms of its international status, its internal functioning, and all of that is linked to the past. So that's why the past remains relevant. But also, despite a lot of efforts and discussion about the past and how to deal with it, especially courts, internationally supported courts in the last decades, that is just one part of the process. I mean, dealing with the past is a very complex societal process where the kind of judicial aspect is just one. But then there are others. There's dealing with victims, dealing with different narratives about how to remember, and so there needs to be a space for that. And this is something where we thought that the 25th anniversary of the end of the war is a good moment to look back, to look at both what has been done, but obviously understanding that this process is incomplete and it remains highly relevant for society. So this is why it seems like a relevant topic to focus on.
I mean, for me, it's not even dealing with the past, it's very much present. The past years, especially after the Russian aggression in Ukraine, we have had these narratives of the 90s, coming back to the Balkans, the fear of the war, and, you witness that people are still processing all the trauma. And it's not just the case of Kosovo, the same was in Bosnia and Herzegovina. And also, I've been through this war, and for me, it was the journey. It was very interesting because in the past, I have worked on German-French, reconciliation processes, German-Polish reconciliation processes. I've worked a lot in the Balkans, but I've never just sat and looked at the case of Kosovo isolated from the rest. And for me, it was a journey going through not only what happened in the past 20 years, but also as a society, how we are processing all of this. I believe that 25th anniversary is actually quite a good window of opportunity, because immediately after the war, it's almost impossible to actually enter this process because it's still painful. It is still a lot of trauma and people want to move on. In Kosovo, this willingness to just close the war chapter as soon as possible and move on and look healed and look all well. And then there is the window for processing everything institutionally, societally, it opens gradually, and I think 2 decades are already, like a good opportunity to sort of, have this process take ground in more serious way. And then, of course, I agree with Florian, having Kosovo, like going through the dialogue with Serbia, having the special court, which is like one of the most probably, debatable issue in the past 5 years when it comes to transitional justice through the court, pillar, you would see that, there is a lot to talk about. There is a lot to talk about, not only what happened in relations to Serbia, but also to have our common narrative about the war, each role of every person and every, segment of society in the war. And this feels like, it's a good opportunity, and I'm thankful that I was part of it, and we are doing this in Pristina.
Thank you. I want to go back actually to this very concrete thing you both were mentioning, the narratives. Mm-hmm. There are different narratives regarding the war. There are diverging narratives about what happened during the war, how the war is impacting the society also on the current state. I think it would be interesting to see what are for you these main narratives which are still dominantly impacting, I think, also this individual level, but also I think this kind of political discourse on a more societal level. What would be, from your research or from your experience, these narratives? What are they?
Well, I would say that there are, of course, there are multiple narratives within a society, in any society. Although I think in most of the societies which went through war in the 90s, there's often a hegemonic, a dominant narrative, which is often a nationalist one. I think this is the case in Kosovo, this is the case in Serbia, this is the case in Bosnia, in Croatia, and these are narratives which basically perpetuate much of the way in which the war was looked at the time. It emphasizes usually one's own victimhood, it emphasizes the aggression by the other, it downplays crimes committed by one's own side, and I'm saying this as a generalization, being very much aware that the scale of crimes committed is not equal in the wars. So, in the case of Kosovo, it's very clear that it's the, Serbian military rule over Kosovo in the 80s, in the 90s, as well as then the expulsion and the murders, which are primarily the responsibility of Serbia. But again, each narrative is very much self-reinforcing and nationalist. There was an opening, I would say, in the decade after the wars to reflect a bit more critical, but I think it's become more difficult. And all of these narratives, they work in a certain way in communication, because these are nationalist narratives which are informed by the other nationalist narratives. So when in Serbia there is a commemoration of the war exclusively through the eyes of Serbian victims, in Kosovo it's less likely to acknowledge that there were actually also Serbian victims. So these are mutually in a certain way strengthening each other, and this actually makes it very difficult to deal with the past, because there's very little space for acknowledging, first of all, the fact that there are victims on all sides, again, without saying that they're equal, but just saying there are victims on all sides. Also, acknowledging that that basically there has to be space for multiple voices. And this is, I think, the other element which is essential, is that dealing with the past does not mean you come up with the truth, with a single narrative, but rather to acknowledge that people experience the war very differently. And I think this is where a lot of people today, in all of the societies, in Kosovo, in Serbia and elsewhere, often feel excluded by the dominant narratives. And they don't have to be from another national background or ethnic background, but they often feel like they're not part of the official narrative because their personal story is very different from what the state and the main, educational system, the media, tell society. And those people often feel marginalized and excluded because their personal stories, which are real experiences, are excluded, are kind of deleted from the public record. And so I think it's very important in this process to acknowledge that there are multiple remembrances of these events. It doesn't change they're establishable facts. They're facts you can establish what happened, who committed which crime and so on. But a war is always a complex moment, and it also raises questions of, when did the war begin? When did it end? These are not easily answerable questions. And again, acknowledging the complexity, acknowledging that it's not just a simple story of one side is responsible for everything and the other side is completely innocent, is helpful. And this is what dealing with the past means, acknowledging the complexity and the individual experiences in these larger processes.
Donika, I want to exactly also kind of connect to this kind of answer, because it emphasizes also what you're mentioning in the report, that a strong emphasis within transitional justice processes dealing with the past processes in Kosovo are laid on criminal persecution or normative tools within transitional justice, which on the other side are somehow neglecting or marginalizing other efforts, especially if we look at truth-seeking, remembrance, the question of reparations or non-reoccurrence in itself, so how to prevent, again, violence in the region. In your opinion, why do we have this imbalance here? Why do we have this emphasis on these normative processes, then rather on maybe also looking at the narratives, looking at this question of the individual stories?
Well, I mean, first of all, it's not basically, it wasn't our decision on designing the approach on dealing with the past. It was something that was imposed. In our papers we argue that it's something that came from outside. We have been introduced to this reconciliation, dealing with the past concepts immediately after the war, while we're still building institutions from scratch, having like UNMIK basically leading the country until 2008. So it was you need a society which is a very, very much sort of understanding all these concepts in order to, in parallel, work on all elements of dealing with the past in parallel. What was the easiest thing to do at that time was, okay, who committed crime? So these people committed crime, we go after these people, and how do we do this? We do this through courts, through the justice pillar. And even that, in that particular pillar in Kosovo, we had no ownership, because in the beginning we had the UNMIK courts, and all these, like cases have been processed through courts which were almost completely detached from the locals. And then in 2008 we had the shift from UNMIK to ULX, as we are arguing in the paper, and we don't even know how this transfer actually worked, because there are a lot of people who came out after saying that, I filed my case with UNMIK, it was never forwarded to ULX, and we had to start everything from scratch. And in parallel there was the ICTY, in which was dealing with crimes across Yugoslavia, and there many Kosovars, actually Kosovo Albanians, feel like it didn't deal enough with crimes committed in Kosovo, because the scope was all over the region, former Yugoslavia. There were like bigger cases going on, and like after ICTY closed, just almost like collided with something that was created by the special court, the specialist chambers on Kosovo. So it felt like it was always hybrid. It never belonged to the locals. In Kosovo, if you argue that why we're having specialist chambers, because we could have done it here in Kosovo, there is an argument that we never had the chance to actually do it on our own.
But you also argued that most of the efforts on dealing with the past or in the whole area is led by civil society organizations, which are actually even more than the government or the political groups or elites committed to this process.
Exactly. So then the other part, which is more difficult, which is more, like dealing with communities, with people, it was, done by civil society organizations. That's why in the paper I call it like a process almost led entirely by CSOs, and who in the beginning, like you would see, working door to door, going village to village, actually trying to collect stories of people, like even bringing together Albanians and Serbs to share their stories. I mean, there are beautiful stories that and in terms of initiative, not the stories itself, but the initiative that, for instance, back then Valdeti Idrizi, back in Blaka, was doing with their colleagues from Serbia, going to Mitrovica and meeting the locals and really, trying to make them hear each other's stories, because you can't have a single narrative. But all this job has been done by civil society organizations who had most of the support was coming from international donors, did not have the capacities, but at some point weren't even able to push processes like having a strategy on dealing with the past, on transitional justice, which would further institutionalize all pillars of dealing with the past, rather than just focusing on what UNMIC, EULEX, ICTY, specialist chambers, and all these courts would do to bring justice to victims. And while we have focused so much on that solely, we forgot that we cannot just rely on the Brussels dialogue between Kosovo and Serbia, or the courts in The Hague, or even like we can't just expect that once Serbia is held accountable for everything that happened in Kosovo, we will just automatically heal. It's a process that has to happen also among us. And this is something that, because of this, justice pillar being so much emphasized, but also because of us not handling it properly since the beginning, we sort of sidelined the emotional part of it and the societal part of it.
I just want to have maybe a short answer to the question of civil society actors in the whole process, because there is also a lot of criticism towards the civil society sector, in the sense what has been achieved in these 25 years through these actors in dealing with the past. Florian, would you be able to see from your perspective now, from the paper, what were kind of these achievements the civil society has, but also what kind of challenges or obstacles they are facing? Because I think 25 years is a long time, where also sector topics, narratives are changing constantly, and also the political environment landscape is changing in which they are working. What would you see here as the major achievements, but also if you could elaborate also on the challenges?
Well, and I think there's a very vibrant civil society in Kosovo, and there are very intense contacts both within Kosovo, between different communities created by civil society, but also with Serbia. And I mean, it's become quite normal, I think, in civil society that these contacts exist, that there are regular meetings, there's regular exchanges, there's joint publications, there's joint projects. All of that is not, within civil society, not at all controversial anymore. It doesn't mean that one agrees on everything, but one has no problem to work together. Like, one has a common understanding, in many cases. I mean, it doesn't say that it works in every single topic, but I think it is.
Medita Dobadan, for example, which was now banned, for example.
But it was banned by the state, right? The organizations work together, right? It's not that that cooperation is made difficult by the civil society. So this is then the obstacle. So I would say, because one often says, well, what have these organizations achieved? They've achieved a lot in terms of these contacts and making it normal for these organizations to work together. The obstacles are obvious. The obstacles are often governments which promote nationalist narratives, and which make it sometimes very difficult. And then NGOs, civil society activists, academics are targeted. I mean, not just festivals are banned, but we have cases where individuals are singled out and are subject to witch hunts, basically, both in Serbia as well as in Kosovo, for saying things which are unpopular, whether it's social media campaigns or whether it's media campaigns. And this is something which, of course, makes their life very difficult. But again, this is in a certain way not. Civil society cannot change the whole society. There has to be other actors. There has to be the state. So they're fighting an uphill battle in many of the cases. So I think it's not their responsibility or ability to change the whole society against the wills of governments who are trying to, in a certain way, shut down these debates. But I think that they've kept and they've created a lot of channels. I mean, if we think back 20 years ago, 25 years ago, there was very little ability of civil society to jointly work together between Belgrade and Pristina, for example. It's gotten more difficult in recent years again. unfortunately. But this is not for the lack of these channels existing. I mean, there are hundreds of activists who've crossed the border, thousands who've traveled regularly to Belgrade or Pristina, and who are eager to do it. They are put obstacles in place by the governments. But this is in a certain way not because they don't want to, but because they are confronted with, I would say, a worsening of the environment in which they're operating.
You're also mentioning in the paper as one kind of opportunity for the future where those discussions can happen, for example, the Belgrade-Pristina dialogue. It could be that there is a major shift there which could help establishing dealing with the past as one major topic to discuss on, or at least for the discussions on dealing with the past. In several days or 2 weeks, we have the Berlin process, the 10th anniversary of the Berlin process around the corner. Why do you see these conferences or this the dialogue as a potential opportunity here?
Well, I see the Berlin process as a process which, in a way, tried to bring reconciliation at the regional level, prioritize it, not necessarily throughout the 10-year period. It had its ups and downs. I do find, actually, Brussels dialogue more obstructive to dealing with the past, because it has managed to politicize everything, and it has put almost everything in this, I call it a dump of problems that Brussels throws, and while it doesn't have the mandate or even the political capital to actually deal with all these problems that are being placed in that basket called Brussels dialogue. Furthermore, there is a lot of tension in the Brussels dialogue, and because it never had a specific framework, we just kept adding and adding things and topics in the past 10 years that now we don't even know what's the aim of it. And most of the time it is this process, especially predominantly Serbia, because it has fueled this nationalist narrative, but in Kosovo it becomes part of daily politics, which is seen mostly as an obstacle to Kosovo's functioning internally, but also its ability to form bilateral relations and participate in the international arena. So I find the Brussels dialogue as very destructive, and at this point I really think that they should be almost completely detached from dealing with the past. Reconciliation and transitional justice, which are completely different processes. Berlin process is good because we need a regional approach to the problem. We have our domestic level, which is very difficult, then bilateral issues between the countries in the region, and then there is this regional sort of umbrella offered by the Berlin process. But in my opinion, like in most of the cases, they put reconciliation because it was just it had to be there. I mean, they created something like RICO, which is quite good because it's forward-looking. It fosters communication, cooperation between people. There is mobility, so people can still talk to each other even if they have different narratives about the past or perceptions, because some of the young people did not even live the wars in Yugoslavia. So I think it's a good initiative there, but sometimes it feels like it's either the EU and the member states not knowing what to do with the funds, and they just throw it on reconciliation and never follow out. So it's like some half-baked ideas that are here and there, and there is lack of will from the countries of the Western Balkans to push it on the agenda, genuinely. So it's always there, but actually not really as strong as we would like it to be, and to deliver to the citizens as much as we would want it to deliver. But it's always good to have these platforms, so at least regionally we maintained an open channel of cooperation and communication. We mentioned in the paper RECOM, and most of the interviews I had with Kosovo Albanians in Kosovo, the issue was always like, okay, we had this initiative, it could have been good, it failed, but at least on the civil society level we're trying to maintain it, and we're trying to sort of make it work, although it's very difficult to do so.
One of your statements in the report is that the public narrative around dealing with the past is heavily politicized in a way, and you're pleading that especially also the Kosovo government is kind of changing its approach towards these narratives, meaning it should include a more diverse, inclusive and multi-perspective approach to dealing with the past. We have now a strategy, a national transitional justice strategy, where also different kind of concrete actions are being suggested. For example, a presidential Truth and Reconciliation Commission. How would you assess this kind of steps towards your recommendation you have in the report, Florian?
Well, I mean, it seems clear that the strategy lacks that kind of full inclusion which is desirable. I mean, I think this is the point, is that, you know, it doesn't have that, you know, the level of inclusiveness which I think any dealing with the past should have. It doesn't mean that it can't be made more inclusive, or that, you know, in implementation it can't be improved. I think that's certainly a possibility. But, you know, again, governments are leaders, have to be leaders in this process, but they have to do it in partnership with other actors. They have to, you know, listen to other actors. There can be civil society, but they also have to be the political opposition. I mean, again, you need all the voices in society, because dealing with the past means multiple pasts, right? And multiple, you know, like it's a societal process. So, you know, while we would argue that governments have a responsibility and to initiate these processes, so it's good that there is a strategy, it's good to have a commission foreseen, these are important elements, but they have to be inclusive. They have to be speaking for those who don't agree with the government, because otherwise, again, you get only one process, one part of the past, but not a more kind of comprehensive dealing with the past. It has to include Kosovo Serbs, just as well as Kosovo Albanians, as well as Roma and other communities. It has to include those who don't agree with the government and those who don't agree with the government. It has to do with grassroots and, you know, kind of government institutions. Otherwise, it's only part of the picture, and then the risk is that the process then becomes, again, politicized. I mean, this is something we worry about, that these processes then get exclusively, don't offer multiple perspectives, but then get just replaced or try to even cement one perspective on the past. And if you end up with a process where only one voice, one way of looking at the past is the end result, then nothing has been achieved.
At the end, I just want to have one question for both of you. And I would like for you to mention maybe one observation or one kind of anecdote you had from the research which actually makes you somehow hopeful about dealing with the past, or very concerned about dealing with the past. So I think that would be maybe Donika, if you want to start.
I think, you know, like, the strategy is flawed, and I mean, it's not written in stone. It's a strategic document. It could be amended. It could be changed. I think it's a good first step that the governments finally, you know, managed to do. It has been a process that started since early 2000, and then it was dragged on, discontinued, and finally we have a strategy. So I think it's a good starting point, but we should have a critical approach to it, not only to the document, but also to its implementation. So we know that it's flawed. We know that it lacks, you know, not just, you know, like the narrative, but also the time frame. Is it like just the years of war, NATO bombing, or is before? It's early 80s, it's up to 2004 or before. So I think we can always have a critical approach while trying to implement it, try to see ways to change it, make amendments accordingly. So this is a good starting point. For me, it was a grim, you know, experience to actually have the interviews with activists who were giving everything to make this process a success story. They often took the responsibility of the government, of the state, you know, opening museums, you know, doing data collection, talking to people, trying to connect communities in an environment that wasn't favorable for them. Like in most of the cases, I witnessed how, Feride Rushidi was the one who actually, not only helped women, but also was providing evidence in different court cases, which is amazing, given the fact that, these organizations don't have resources. So trying to be more positive, I think this strategy is a good starting point. Civil society organizations should be supported. I think it should be more inclusive. It should include also the voices of the opposition, and not only like different ethnic groups in Kosovo, but also political parties in Kosovo. More of civil society. It's a very engaging, complex process in which the government cannot claim and should not claim monopoly. Now we will have also recently, in September this month, we also got the news that the Truth Commission, which was in a way functioning under Thashi's presidency, will be again either revitalized, or we will be having something new, completely developed from scratch. Whatever it is, I don't think that these processes should be linked to a political figure or a particular institution. These processes should belong to Kosovo, to the society of Kosovo, and we should put an end to over-politicization, because we don't want this process to become a topic for the next elections. We want this process to actually serve the citizens of Kosovo from each ethnic background.
Yeah, I would say there are two things, positive things I take away. First of all, that there is still a conversation about this topic in Kosovo. In other countries, it's actually impossible to have a conversation about this, dealing with the past. In Serbia, you cannot have a conversation about it in a societal context. Activists talk about it, but they're shut down. They're much more vulnerable. Elsewhere as well, in Bosnia and Herzegovina, it's nearly impossible to have a conversation about this. So the fact that you can still have a conversation, and one which is critical and which is, at least not conclusive, is already an opening. It's a space to create a process. What it will lead to, we don't know, but it creates a space. I think that's the first encouraging sign, with all the obstacles, all the difficulties we're aware of. And the second one is, of course, that there are these activists who are actually doing a lot of this work. Now, of course, you can look at it negatively, you can say it's frustrating that it's the activists who are doing the job which should be done by state actors. But the fact that there are many activists who've been doing this, and who have been doing it for 2 decades, is, I think, important to acknowledge as an achievement as a society, that there are these people who've been, and their work they've been doing leaves traces. I think it's often when people think in project cycles and the project is over and so it's done, but of course they produce not just paper, but material output of their work, whether it is individuals who've been able to talk about their experiences, whether it's contexts which are created. So they're building something up, even if it's maybe sometimes a Sisyphus kind of a task, but it's there. And that always suggests, this is also when foreign diplomats or observers sometimes ask me, why do you even bother? Why is it even worth doing something in Kosovo, in the region? I say, well, because there are people there who are actually trying, and as long as they are there, it's worth investing, and it's worth trying to make, trying to enable them and help them to reach their goals, and that leaves me still optimistic despite all the obstacles which are there.
Thank you very much, Donika. Thank you very much, Florian, for joining us today here, and also for the conversation tomorrow, the public event where you will present the full results of the research, and also we will have a broader discussion with different actors, with different stakeholders. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Chris.